welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. I'm your host, MagMongoSlade. On June 3rd, 2024, an article was posted in Penn Live, which is a magazine in Pennsylvania. And they asked the question, is WWE getting too violent? This led to a short article where the writer questioned WWE's increase in blood and profanity and drew some level of comparisons to the Attitude Era. This, of course, because of The Rock and Cody Rhodes and all the stuff that was going on during WrestleMania. So they did a short article where they asked essentially some parents that were going to the show in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was put on that same night. And they talked to the parents and some chaperones of some children and asked them, hey, do you think WWE is getting a little too violent with all the profanity and the blood? I'll save you the trouble of individual answers, but most of them actually said no, that they were actually excited to see the show. And what found interesting was how some of these people, one of these young ladies had driven 4 hours from Maryland to see the Raw show in Hershey, Pennsylvania. She was not in any way concerned about the blood and the violence. But they did express some concerns about the swearing and the blood. That was an uptick from that specific 0 to the Rock's out there cussing every once in a while. And now Cody's bleeding and, other people are bleeding too. They were concerned about that, but they didn't feel like it had gotten too violent. But their article is what got my attention because in the article, it links back to this awful announcing site, which is where they got the comparisons between modern 2024 WWE and the Attitude Era. And it was basically due to the Cody and Rock segment where the Rock was cussing and Cody was bleeding. And that took me down the rabbit hole of this question comes up a lot, whether WWE is too violent. And I saw numerous articles over the years discussing this subject and decided I'm going to talk about it. April of last year, April 3rd, 2023, the Safe app, which is an app for parents to monitor their children what they're watching on television, they asked whether the WWE's PG rating was actually justified, meaning should it be actually rated higher due to violence? And they based their answer, which is no, it's not justified and it should be raised, on 2 very old studies, one from Sports Journal and another one from the National Center for Health. They decided that watered down violence is still violence, but it is not the same as cartoons and video games, which children easily recognize as being not real. That the violence in wrestling can be considered more realistic because it's real people really hitting each other with chairs, real people really jumping off the top rope on each other, real people really punching and kicking at each other, and sometimes even making real contact. And one of the studies that they used, that Safe app used, to come up with their answer, it comes from the National Center for Health. This study was from 2008 and 2006. Where they did a study that relied on another study, which of course we're going to have to go into, about children and the effects of television wrestling on children. The article is called What Not to Do, Watch TV Wrestling. It's by Blossom Paravato at the National Center for Health. And I'm going to give you basically a short overview of what some of the outcomes were. They said that dating violence, one of the differences between people who within dating violence, or what we call today domestic violence, is whether you watched pro wrestling or not. They said that girls who watched pro wrestling were involved with violence more often than boys who watched. That physical fights, such as being victimized and being the victimizer, is increased when kids watch wrestling. Using Ritalin without prescription, which is basically drug usage. Carrying weapons, guns, or other types of weapons. That boys were more likely to drink and drive. They were more likely to chew tobacco. Girls were more likely to fight. They were more likely to smoke weed and to do ride-alongs with people who are drunk and driving. Robert Dumont is the name of the researcher who was looking into this subject, and the studies from 2008 and 2006 were both his studies. Back in 2017, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry decided that extensive viewing of television violence by children causes greater aggressiveness, but only if the violence is extremely realistic and frequently repeated and unpunished, because children are impressionable and are more likely to repeat and imitate what they see. This, of course, puts them in the same category as pro wrestling. They didn't use the exact words pro wrestling because they were also talking about other forms of violence. But this goes right into the same thing. Now, the foundational article that started all this stuff is from Matthew Bernthal. It was published in February of 2008 in the Sports Journal. What he did was he tried to research violence in children through teacher observation. So basically, he sent questionnaires to teachers and said, hey, what are you seeing in your students that like pro wrestling? And this is a foundational piece because the first article that I mentioned here, if you follow down the rabbit hole, it all starts right here for the most part. Okay. And this actually is a very interesting article if you read it, because he knows the history. He did the research. He talks about Vince McMahon separating WWF from the rest of pro wrestling, which allows the company to eschew the idea of legitimacy that is in any way real, and to make it more fun and campy and cartoonish, etc., while still not changing the idea that it's still pro wrestling. And they did a lot of target marketing. He talked about the WWF marketing to the 18 to 34-year-old male demographic with excessive violence and sexuality, but said that there's a lot of children who watch the show, and these children can be as young as 12. So he says that the WWF's real market is somewhere between 12 and 24. So he said that these two things are the reasons for the WWF's success and its continued success. That Vince McMahon separated it from the rest of pro wrestling by saying it's not real, it's 100% fantasy, but, you know, it still looks real enough. And because they target market to 18 to 24-year-old males, when in reality it's more like 12 to 24. Then he says that WWF engages in, quote, unethical targeting towards children because he feels that WWF invades what he called the cognitive scripts of young children. Basically, these are basically like routines that influence their behavior. So, but he says, and I quote, "We do not know the extent to which the kids act out such scripts in relation to pro wrestling." In other words, they're saying there are behaviors that children see and imitate, but we don't know to what degree these children imitate what they see. And that's what this article is trying to answer. How often are children imitating the things that they see? So the teachers, when they responded to the questionnaires, the results were that wrestling fans were more active, but they were also more aggressive at recess. They were more into troublemaking because they were more rebellious. They were less studious because they had lower grades. So they're pinning pro wrestling, or the WWF specifically, on lower academic achievement and violence and drug use, etc. Now, we get into some really fun stuff here because the teachers are told, hey, here's some things. What are you noticing? So we start with the children's favorite wrestlers. 61% of the children said Stone Cold Steve Austin was their favorite wrestler. 34% said The Rock. 24% said Goldberg. 20% said The Undertaker. 14% said Hulk Hogan. 13.5% said D-Generation X. Now, when you look at this, when they start asking about moves and gestures, which of course is not violence, but they're looking at it as, in some ways, delinquency in the children, disrespect. Now, we do start with violence, however. 28% of the teachers said they saw one student body slam another student. 23% said they saw a student punch or kick another student. 20% claimed they have seen a chokehold or a clothesline or even a pedigree or a pile driver during recess. 8.1% saw headlocks. 6.8% saw a student jump off something onto another student. But 57.9% of these had never seen an injury. So almost 60% of the teachers never saw any injury in the students when they were doing these dangerous maneuvers. 74% of the teachers say they only saw scrapes, bruises, cuts as outcomes from these wrestling moves. 24% said they saw head or neck injuries. This would be, again, bruises or, kids getting knocked out or whatever. 10% said they saw muscle tears or muscle strains. And 6% said they saw broken bones. So they're talking about, children at recess playing around. And 6% of the kids, thereabouts, broke bones. But most of the injuries were not serious at all. Now, we start talking about gestures, language, etc. So you saw 25% of the teachers saw crotch chops. 27% of them saw middle fingers, of course, Stone Cold Steve Austin. 10% heard the word ass. 7% heard the word son of a bitch. 15.7% of the teachers chronically heard suck it in or around the classroom. So when you look at the parent councils of the late 90s that were talking about WWF being responsible for the death of children who are using wrestling holds, I talked about that on this channel before. Please see those videos. Those are very interesting and engaging. These teachers are saying basically pro wrestling is not suitable for children and that kids are imitating what they see. Now, I do have some issues with this information. For starters, I believe that this is a human error. When you're asking people, do you see punches and kicks? It's like, okay, well, you can see punches and kicks anywhere. Body slams, chokeholds, clotheslines, okay. Those are wrestling specific. But a punch or a kick, those things are, you can see that in any video game. And not just, I know they're trying to eliminate video games from the conversation, but video games and cartoons, especially since like Dragon Ball Z was a big thing in the 90s. You probably saw kids trying to, kick each other in the head or trying to do spin kicks from, playing Street Fighter or whatever. Trying to lay that on wrestling, I'm not entirely okay with that. But body slams, yes, kids should not be body slamming each other. They shouldn't be trying to do pedigrees on one another. That's the one that jumped out at me as being absolutely insane. Like, I didn't see the word Stone Cold Stunner in this article at all. And I personally was involved with quite a few run around Stone Cold Stunners when I was, 12, 13 years old. So, I mean, in headlocks, that's one of the things I expected to see almost 80% because every generic bully in the world grabs a headlock. That's one of the first things that they do. So it was kind of like, okay, it doesn't quite line up with my experience being a student in the 90s because I saw quite a few headlocks. I saw almost no drop kicks, no pedigrees whatsoever. I don't know where that came from. But yeah, kids were hurt. We often jumped off of things onto each other, which we could thank Mick Foley for because he popularized that, at least with us, him jumping off the roof of his house onto his friends, but we didn't do a lot of this stuff. Also, you have to take into account the human error in observations that unless the teacher also watches wrestling, they may mistake certain things that kids are picking up somewhere else as things that they're picking up from pro wrestling, such as son of a bitch, SOB. If their parents curse in the house, then it's more likely for them to pick up cursing words. So words like ass. Now, suck it and crotch chops, those things are more wrestling specific. You almost never see those out in the world. They're never in video games. They're never in like comic books or in movies or anything like that. It's pretty much a pro wrestling thing. But cursing, like son of a bitch and ass, I mean, maybe they listen to a lot of rap music. Who knows? One of my big issues, of course, is that correlation does not equal causation. That we know that pro wrestling appeals to younger people and people who are lower on the economic strata. And that perhaps you have a lot of younger people and people who are less educated watching pro wrestling. And it's not the cause of them being uneducated. So when they talk about these kids having lower grades, it's like, I don't know if pro wrestling is the reason. Maybe pro wrestling appeals to them because they are more physical and less brainy, let's say. And oftentimes this is, of course, boys. Now, when you talk about boys, boys often do worse in school than girls. So they have typically lower grades than girls. So that could also be a skew in the information. So if you're not separating boys and girls and saying, well, boys naturally, or I wouldn't say naturally, but boys for 20 or 30 years or so have had lower grades in school than girls and higher dropout rates, and they're more rebellious. Well, that seems to line up with the target audience, or the audience that's watching WWE. If you understand that boys are more rebellious than girls, they're more troublemaking than girls, they're more aggressive than girls, they're more violent than girls, physically violent. Girls have different forms of violence. They study less than girls. They have less academic achievement than girls. So there's this huge confounding factor in gender. Gender is a huge, issue here that is not addressed. It's all blamed on pro wrestling. So I wouldn't say 100% that. Again, body slams, clotheslines, putting people in sleepers. Yeah, we can talk about that being problematic. But a lot of the other things that they're looking at in terms of children can be picked up with it just being boys. Boys typically pick on each other, physically bully each other, push each other around. They play rough. That's what we do. To blame that on pro wrestling is like, I don't know about that. Now, if you combine that the boy watches pro wrestling, then you get body slams. Then you get clotheslines. Then you might get somebody trying to pile drive somebody else. But you have to separate the natural inclination of boys to be physical with each other from the fact that pro wrestling is making them that way. But the Sports Journal article in its totality was actually pretty good. I found it to be very entertaining and very interesting. So Matthew Bernthal did a good job. Now, unfortunately, a lot of this information the data was put together in the 90s. So here is, of course, the big issue is that WWE today is PG. WWE in the Attitude Era was TV-14, or what some people even consider TVMA. So when you're collecting the data to do a research study that you're going to publish in 2008, well, you're 7 or 8 years off of all this stuff regularly occurring. And then when you're repeating this in 2017, well, you're 7 or 8 years into the PG era already. When you're repeating this stuff in 2023, you're almost 20 years into the PG era. So when you have a study or you have information, this information should be updated over time. And I don't see that the pro wrestling is violent studies or research has been updated. And anything that seems to be making a comment on this seems to always go back a decade or more. Now, that's just basically how social science works, is that you do a study, it takes a while for it to get out. I mean, you have to send out the questionnaires, they have to fill out the questionnaires, you have to get the information back, you have to study the information, you have to write it, you have to find an article to publish it. This kind of stuff takes time. So your information could be obsolete by the time it comes out. Now, no doubt, Matthew Bernthal, probably, I don't know if he's a fan or not, I didn't look him up, but let's say that he's not a fan, he's just a social sciencey guy, he works in a lab. All right, so then does he know that pro wrestling in 2008 is different than pro wrestling in 1998? He may know, he may not know. But there are certainly people in 2024 who know that pro wrestling is different than it was in 1998. It's different than it was even in 2006 when Robert Dumont was doing his studies. And the Robert Dumont studies were very strange too, because they were saying things like, children who watch pro wrestling were more likely to do Ritalin without a prescription. It's like, well, I've never seen that on a wrestling show. They were more likely to drink and drive. Okay, well, maybe Stone Cold Steve Austin was drinking a lot, but I don't know if that's correlated or, if that's causational. So you ask the questions. Are you looking at realistic outcomes that are not attached to other things. What are the confounding factors? Well, another one of these confounding factors is, again, the 18 to 24, 18 to 34, demographic, and the 12 to 24 legitimate demographic is that they're drinking and driving. They're probably 16 or something like that, around that age bracket. Those people are not really all that influenced by pro wrestling. I mean, they may wrestle because, again, boys, they're rough. But things like smoking weed, getting drunk, come on. Those are teenagers. Whether they watch wrestling or not, I think that's just teenage behavior. And I'm very loath to blame pro wrestling for those kinds of things. Now, I do agree with some of the studies that are saying that pro wrestling violence is more legitimate than video game violence or cartoon violence. That is absolutely true. A wrestler is hitting each other with chairs. They know how to do it where they don't hurt each other, but it is true that one wrestler is hitting another with a chair. It is true that a wrestler is jumping off the top rope onto somebody else. That is absolutely true. Whether it's an axe smash, an elbow smash, a moonsault, or whatever, it is true that one real person is jumping off a high object onto another real person. Those things are absolutely true. Now, Robert Durant, one of the researchers that I mentioned here, in Scientific American in 2001, he did put a little bit of a bow on this conversation. I'm actually going to read this quote. He says, "The bottom line is that we are affected by what we expose ourselves to. Wrestling doesn't in itself cause violence, but when combined with overall socialization, violence on television can affect what is perceived as socially acceptable behavior." So that is their issue, is that wrestling seems to reinforce negative behaviors. Instead of looking at it from the perspective that, sometimes bad guys get what they deserve, they look at it from the perspective of you're reinforcing violence as a way to solve problems. You're reinforcing crass behavior, negative behaviors. So this is what you see in pro wrestling, and they should be held up to that standard, which is okay. I'm fine with that. So this I thought was an interesting subject and decided to bring it to you guys. So let me know what you think. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.
MagMongoSlade. Best house I ever drew, daddy.